Mr. Sharma is 68 years old, and he has over 30 million rupees sitting in the bank. Yet in the peak of summer, with temperatures nearing 40 degrees Celsius, he sits sweating through his shirt because he absolutely refuses to pick up the remote and turn on the air conditioning. He wants to save on the electricity bill. This is a surprisingly common scenario. Across the country, there is a quiet epidemic of successful retirees who spent 40 years aggressively building massive nest eggs, yet voluntarily live their final decades as if they are entirely broke. Financial planners call this the switch failure. Take a look at this timeline. It shows the typical path of wealth, a 40-year upward climb known as the accumulation phase. But at retirement, instead of curving downward into the decumulation phase, the line hits a rigid psychological wall and flatlines. By flatlining their spending, these retirees are actively sacrificing the final, healthiest years of their lives. They deny themselves basic comforts to maintain a massive financial safety net they will likely never dip into. It turns out, mastering the mathematics of accumulating wealth is entirely different from mastering the psychology of utilizing it. Without the psychological tools to transition from saving to spending, a massive financial victory turns into a lived tragedy. To understand this block, you have to look at the prior 40 years. For these retirees, aggressive saving served as a vital survival mechanism against severe economic volatility and unpredictable job markets. Through decades of daily repetition, they carved deep neural pathways in their brains. The act of saving became inextricably linked to the feeling of safety. Because of that hardwiring, the mere thought of dipping into their principal, the original core sum of their life savings, triggers actual physical distress. That physical distress is fueled by two macroeconomic fears: the looming threat of extreme longevity and the historical trauma of watching inflation erode the purchasing power of the rupee over their working lives. This graph illustrates how those fears warp financial planning. Here is a normal, reasonable life expectancy curve, but overshadowing it is this massive, exaggerated spike, representing the absolute worst-case scenario: living to 105 years old with catastrophic medical bills. Retirees hold their present reality hostage to fund this statistical anomaly. A retirement date circled on a calendar is powerless against 40 years of survival programming. The human brain simply cannot overwrite its primary defense mechanism overnight. Because the brain remains locked in survival mode, the switch failure manifests in highly specific symptoms, everyday decisions of self-imposed hardship that defy basic logic. The most common symptom is the fixed deposit trap. Retirees flatly refuse to touch their principal. Instead, they stubbornly attempt to live exclusively off the meager interest generated by their bank deposits. But there is a hidden mathematical flaw in that strategy. If we look at this bar chart comparing fixed deposit interest returns directly against the real rate of inflation, you can clearly see the problem. Look at this negative gap. Because inflation constantly drives up the cost of goods, the untouched principal secretly loses its actual purchasing power year after year. Then there is the travel and medical paradox. Retirees will choose grueling 30-hour train rides over cheap flights, or delay necessary life-improving surgeries because the immediate cost feels too high. As the chart shrinks, you can see the irrationality. The massive scale of their untouched principal absolutely dwarfs the incredibly tiny fraction required to pay for a flight or a medical procedure. Finally, there is the inheritance burden. Retirees live out their final years like paupers, determined to preserve a fortune to hand down to their children. Ironically, those children are usually well-settled, middle-aged adults who do not actually need the money. A hard-earned fortune is supposed to be a tool for well-being. These behavioral symptoms transform it into a persistent, daily source of anxiety. Left unchecked, this behavior leads to a quietly tragic conclusion. Retirees pass away, leaving behind massive, entirely unspent fortunes, alongside a lifetime of trips untaken and comforts denied. You cannot cure a deeply ingrained psychological fear by staring at a spreadsheet. Overcoming this paralysis requires a deliberate framework designed for emotional reframing. The most effective solution is a segregation method called the bucket strategy. This visual model illustrates how it works. The first bucket is the survival bucket. It holds an untouched fund, mathematically calculated to cover that worst-case scenario. When this bucket fills up and the padlock clicks shut, it provides an undeniable safety net. With survival guaranteed, remaining wealth overflows into the second bucket, the lifestyle bucket, flowing freely to fund travel and comfort, entirely guilt-free. For those who still struggle, financial planners suggest a permission to spend fund. This is a mandatory forced spending mechanism, a set amount of money each month that must be spent on joy, luxury, or comfort. If it isn't spent, it must be donated to charity. Those 40 years of grueling work and disciplined saving were meant to buy freedom. You did not endure decades of economic stress just to end up as the wealthiest patient. Turn on the air conditioning. Buy the flight ticket. Enjoy the life you built.